Well, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. You're just doing a wonderful work, and I'm honored to be able to participate and cooperate with you guys today and this afternoon. The title of my talk is Ideas of Consequences, Reason Matters, People Die. I'm a philosophy professor, and I like to talk about philosophy, but I also like to think about how philosophical ideas have influenced our general culture. And so this afternoon, what I want to talk to you about is how, as pro-lifers, we can think through a lot of these issues that we face, not only politically, but in terms of our conversations with our friends and our neighbors and so forth. Another way of putting it is, I want to talk about what is the debate about abortion. In fact, more generally, what is the debate about the sanctity of human life really about? I mean, at the end of the day, what is the central question? And it seems to me the central question is this. It's about one fundamental question. Who and what are we, and can we know it? What is a human being, and can we know what a human being really is? What does it mean to be human? It's a question that often gets obscured in our postmodern world. In fact, virtually every time somebody wants to talk about the issue of abortion, how to treat the severely handicapped, those at the end of life, everything else gets talked about except for that central question. In fact, just recently on the news, one of the presidential candidates was asked about her view of the nature of the unborn in terms of the Constitution, and she was at a loss for words. I mean, actually, let me put it this way. She doesn't have the glibness of her husband, and she actually revealed one of the difficulties of trying to say, on the one hand, that the Constitution, as currently read and understood by the courts, does not recognize unborn human beings as protectable under our laws. But on the other hand, in order to express that, she had to use language which actually revealed that, in fact, they are one of us. Right? So the interesting thing here is that we're going to be talking about philosophy, but we're also going to be talking about it in a way that helps us better understand and maybe communicate the ideas of the sanctity of life to our friends and our neighbors and maybe our political activism. But let me give you a couple of illustrations of how people, in my own experience that I've had, have tried to avoid this question. 23 years ago, I published a book called Politically Correct Death, Answering Arguments for Abortion Rights. 23, that means I was 15 when I published it. No. And when that book came out in 1993, I did a lot of radio interviews, and one of the radio interviews was with a college station in Ames, Iowa, which would be Iowa State? Is it Iowa State? Okay. Okay. By the way, Cyclones, isn't that a crazy name? I mean, it's like, imagine naming a school like the Plague. You know, it's just, I've always thought like the hurricane and the cyclones, it's like they're natural disasters. You know, it's a weird, what team do you? I play for the Oregon State Plague, So this is, I'm at a radio station in Ames, I'm actually at home. I get a phone call. I'm in my pajamas. I'm being interviewed by this station, and the host says, "Oh, by the way, Professor Beckwith, we have a special guest in the studio who will be helping me ask questions. It's so-and-so from the National Organization for Women." And so, I said, "Sure, that's great. Let's talk." And so the first question doesn't come from the host, it comes from her, and she says, "Well, Professor Beckwith, I'm just wondering, you're a man. What are you doing writing about abortion? This is a women's issue." So now, keep in mind, I'm at home on the phone, so I said, "Well, how do you know I'm a man?" Well, she says, "Well, you have a deep voice." I said, "Well, so does Brenda Vaccaro, and she's not a man." Now, that really dates me, right? People know Brenda Vaccaro is, right? Suzanne Plachette, another one, right? So and I said, and besides, my spouse's name is Frankie. And my name is Francis, and that's a girl's name. And she was really upset. She said, well, the host called you, by the male pronoun. I said, well, perhaps he's mistaken. He's never seen me either. And so we went for about 3 or 4 minutes, and she said, you're a man. She was actually raising her voice, and I actually felt pretty good, And so I said to her, look, I confess, I am a man. I plead guilty to that status. I said, but what's interesting? I said, if you ran across my book in a bookstore and you just saw the name Francis, it is with an I, which is the male, but supposing you didn't know the difference. And how would you evaluate my book? Would you evaluate it based on its content, or would you wonder about the author's gender? And I said, you shouldn't worry about the author's gender. You should worry about the content of the arguments. Now, if my arguments aren't good, then by all means critique them, show me where I'm mistaken, and so forth. But pointing to my gender is precisely what I thought the feminist movement said we shouldn't do, right? So that's one example. And the other involved actually my wife. Both of us grew up in Las Vegas, Nevada. And actually, no one grows up there, they just get older. But in the late 80s, early 90s, I was a professor at UNLV, and my wife was general manager of the Las Vegas Athletic Club. And during that time, there was a petition that was for a ballot question in Nevada, which would have ensured that Roe v. Wade, if it were overturned, would not be the law of Nevada. Because this was 1990, and the Supreme Court, there was actually a lot of possibilities. A lot of people were confident the Supreme Court was going to overturn Roe v. Wade in the case that eventually became Casey versus Planned Parenthood. It didn't do that, but in many of the states, there were political action groups interested in ensuring that if Roe v. Wade were overturned, that the state would go back to the laws before, or that would be, they'd be able to secure the laws that had been in place before Roe v. Wade, whether it was to support abortion rights or, in our case, to prohibit abortion. And so what happened, there was a woman who was working out at the club and asked my wife to sign a petition that was actually for another ballot question that would have said that if Roe v. Wade were overturned, then the law in Nevada would be pro-abortion. Now, my wife is pro-life, and so she was told by this woman, sign it, it'll give your views an opportunity to be voted on, which is technically not true. Well, my wife signed it nonetheless, and I arrived at the club to work out after my day at the university, and so my wife said to me, she said, I signed this, should I have signed it? And this is what so-and-so said it says. And I said, no, that person lied to you. Well, I didn't know she was like standing right here. So she was a local optometrist. She turns to me and she goes, what do you mean I lied? And so we got into this argument about abortion, and a little crowd began like forming around us. It was like West Side Story, right? And what happened, it was actually a pretty good conversation. And then she asked me a question, one that I think it's a very difficult question for pro-lifers to answer. And it's one that I think there's a really good answer, but there's not a good emotionally satisfying answer. There's a difference between having a good answer and an emotionally satisfying answer. You can actually have an answer that is technically morally correct, but the person is really not looking for a morally correct answer. They're looking for something that's more emotionally satisfying. And this was the question of, what about cases of rape or incest? And so I said to her, well, let's set aside the question. I said, let me put it this way. Why don't we imagine there are no cases of rape or incest? Would you still be for abortion rights? She said, yes. I said, then why do you bring it up? It's not relevant to your case. Now, you see what I've done there. and this is part of what I'm trying to achieve this afternoon, to get us back to the question. Because the question is, what is the nature of the human person? Is the fetus one of us? Is it part of the human community? Should it be protected by our laws? But that question, although certainly an important one that we have to answer, there's no doubt we have to answer it, but it gets us off the main question. Because if we first answer the question, let's say in the affirmative, yes, the human fetus is in fact one of us and ought to be protected, then we can answer the rape incest question in light of first answering that other question, right, which is more fundamentally important to answering the issue of abortion rights. Because after all, if the fetus isn't a person, then really, why would bringing up those cases even be a difficulty, right? It would be like having an appendectomy, right? It shouldn't matter at all. So, in order to keep this question full front and center this afternoon, I want to offer you 3 fundamental truths that I hope you will take to heart as ambassadors for the sanctity of life to a world that desperately needs our witness. And these are the 3 principles. Ideas have consequences, reason matters, and people die. Ideas have consequences, reason matters, and people die. Let's go over the first one, ideas of consequences. I'm going to go over several examples here, but what do I mean by saying ideas of consequences? What I mean by that is what one believes makes a difference in how one views the world, one's fellow human beings, and ourselves. That is, our assumptions and beliefs, even beliefs that we're not conspicuously aware of, influence the way we interpret the world. I'm going to give you one example that was used by a professor of mine in graduate school, and it involves a gentleman, and I don't think this story is true. I think it's an apocryphal story, but it's a story that actually, I think, offers a nice illustration on how ideas can influence one and how facts sometimes make no difference if you have certain beliefs. So imagine there's this guy, we'll call him Fred. Fred thinks he's dead, but he's alive, and this is a problem. So his family sends him to a psychiatrist. Psychiatrist sits him down and says, Fred, you're not dead. He goes, well, I believe I'm dead. And so the psychiatrist says, look, if I can convince you of one fact, namely that dead men do not bleed, will you change your mind? Fred says, sure. So they go through all these books on anatomy and physiology, the nature of our anatomy and about the nature of blood and coagulation, all these issues involving medicine that deal with the issue of bleeding. And he says, okay, I'm convinced. Dead men don't bleed. And then when he's not looking, though, the doctor sticks him with a pin. And he sees this blood trickling down, and with an ashen look on his face, he says, my God, dead men do bleed after all. The ideas that you have, what you believe about the world, your background beliefs, make a difference. They make a difference. And this is why many of the questions that face us today in the public square, whether it's issues like the sanctity of life, the nature of marriage, questions about how to interpret the Constitution, all these sorts of questions that divide Americans, behind those questions are beliefs that people hold. And so if you can change or form people's beliefs when they're very young, you stand a chance of actually winning, right? So if you, let's say, run everything, if you run the education system, if you run the universities, if you dominate entertainment and media, and all that people hear all day is that point of view, they're going to interpret the world in light of that point of view. And they're going to be deeply influenced, and they're going to come to believe, though, that their beliefs are objective and rational, right? So, it's interesting, when I was a kid, one of the things that you were always told, and some of you will remember this, don't fall for peer pressure. You know what's interesting today? Peer pressure actually has an app, right? I mean, it's sort of interesting. Now, peer pressure is actually now a virtue, right? Because you are sort of, judged by how many likes you get. right? So it's interesting that you don't hear that much anymore, but it seems as though today we've been deeply influenced by a way of thinking that I think makes it difficult for us to kind of detach ourselves from, let's say, the beliefs that we may think are obviously true. Let me go over another example of ideas having consequences. I'm going to read to you two quotes, and I'm not going to tell you who they're from. I will give you general categories at first, but the first one, I'll just read each quote, and then I'll ask, and I'll tell you from what general categories these quotes from. This is the first quote. And both of them, by the way, have to do with the issue of euthanasia. That is physician-assisted suicide. Planned death is a broad concept which includes capital punishment, suicide, euthanasia, and feticide. Physician involvement should extend far beyond mere termination of life to permit exploitation of the enormous potential benefit that could accrue from the acquisition of organs for transplantation and the performance of daring and otherwise impossible human experiments under irreversible general anesthesia. Okay? What is that author saying? The author is saying we ought to plan death, like at the end of life, like we do with abortion, and we ought to do so with the eye towards using organs for transplantation for human experimentation. Okay? This is another quote. It is impossible to doubt that there are living people to whom death would be a release, and whose death would simultaneously free society and the state from carrying a burden which serves no conceivable purpose except that of providing an example of the greatest unselfishness. And because there actually are human lives in whose preservation no rational being would ever again take any interest, the legal order is now confronted by the fateful question: is it our duty to advocate for this life's asocial continuance or to permit its destruction under specific conditions? Unquote. That's again a defense of euthanasia. One of them is by a contemporary physician well known for his defense of euthanasia, and the other is by one of the founding intellects or philosophers of the German euthanasia movement. Which one is which? The second is from the German euthanasia movement. The first is by Dr. Jack Kevorkian. Now, I could have picked anyone. There are a number of others I could have picked besides Kevorkian. Kevorkian is the most well known. I could have picked someone like Peter Singer or the late James Rachels or a variety of other thinkers who have defended this. My point is, when that article was published called On a Life Not Worth Living, that's not Kevorkian's. That's the title of the two authors that published the article. I think it was 1915. That had a profound influence on the German euthanasia movement. It's called On a Life Not Worth Living. That's it. That, at the time, when that article was published, the idea was simply to allow patients to have the option to kill themselves. Why? Because they had autonomy. They should have a right to do this, right? Also, if they do this, they'll help society. Also, the other argument that you probably detected in there was, well, what rational person would want to be in this state, right? And it all sounds very compassionate and caring, right? Because who does want to be in that kind of state? The problem with that thinking is that if you combine those ideas together, it doesn't actually lead to or just support voluntary euthanasia. It actually supports involuntary euthanasia. Here's why. If you tell people that the justification for euthanasia is no one rational would want to live that way, what do you do in the case of the person who is in that state, who says, I want to be taken off health care, but I don't want to actually kill myself? That is to say, I want to do what pro-lifers believe it is permissible. You can remove burdensome care. But that's not the same as intentionally willing your own death. Okay, supposing somebody takes that position, that is, I'm going to remove the health care, but I don't want to will my own death. I don't want to be injected with a poison that will kill me. Okay? But remember what the German euthanasia doctor said, which is actually prevalent today among defenders of euthanasia in our time. What rational person would want to live that way? that means the person who does not choose to kill himself is in fact, guess what? Not rational, right? So if they're not rational, that means that they really don't have autonomy. That means that someone can stand in their place. Hence, involuntary euthanasia. We've seen it played out in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in other places. We see it now, parents in Europe being given permission to make proxy judgments for their children based on this very type of reasoning. So, ideas have consequences. I'm going to move on to another example. This is a quote from a friend of mine, a friend who will be my colleague next year. I'm going to be next year at the University of Colorado Boulder. I am going to be the visiting professor of conservative thought and policy at the University of Colorado Boulder, and one of my colleagues will be David Boonin, who has published a book called A Defense of Abortion. And David and I are actually good friends. We've exchanged articles with each other. We've actually responded to each other's books. I think he's absolutely wrong about abortion, but he's also a very, very nice guy. And David said this at the beginning of his book, Defense of Abortion. My book, which is called, his book was published in 2002 with Cambridge University Press. Mine was published in 2007 with Cambridge University Press. And about a quarter of his book is a response to articles I'd published and my earlier book. And my book, about a third of my book is a response to David. So we've gone back and forth. And I said, if I could pick an adversary to have, it'd be him, only because he's such a nice person, and he's actually been very gracious to me and said, "You're welcome in the philosophy department at our university." So so I read that. I have to say that before I read this, so you can get an idea of David's personality. But what I'm going to read you is in the preface to his book, and it shows you the influence of a particular set of ideas on the way in which people who write in bioethics think about the unborn. And this is what David says. On the desk in my office, where most of this book was written and revised, there are several pictures of my son Eli. In one, he is gleefully dancing on the sand along the Gulf of Mexico, the cool ocean breeze wreaking havoc with his wispy hair. In the top drawer of my desk, I keep another picture of Eli. The picture was taken September 7th, 1993, 24 weeks before he was born. The sonogram image is murky, but it reveals clearly enough a small head tilted back slightly and an arm raised up and bent, with the hand pointing back toward the face and the thumb extended toward the mouth. There is no doubt in my mind that this picture, too, shows the same little boy at a very early age in his physical development. And there is no question that the position I defend in this book entails that it would have been morally permissible to end his life at this point. It's the punchline, right? Why did David arrive at this point? What's going on? Well, I'll have a little bit more to say about this in a few minutes, but there's an idea that's dominant in bioethics. Some of you are aware of it who have read this literature. Some of you may not be aware of it. But because the evidence that human beings and their lives begin at conception, because it's clear, the science is there. Nobody doubts. If anybody has any doubts, it's usually very early on when you could have what is called twinning, monozygotic twinning, but everybody agrees that by 14 days after conception, I believe it's at conception, but some people, for a variety of reasons, will say 14 days. But even those people will agree, yes, you have a human being, an individual organism, a member of the human species that simply has to develop from that point forward. What it achieves in terms of its development is simply a perfection of what it already is, right? So that evidence is so overwhelming. What's happened, it's been about 40 years since these arguments have begun being spun in the philosophical literature, and what they do is they distinguish between being a human being and being a person. And so what David argues, and some other philosophers argue, is that fetuses are human beings, but they're not persons. Well, what is a person? A person is a being that can engage in rational thought, can engage in self-expression, can communicate, can have a self-concept. Fetuses clearly can't have those things. Neither can my freshmen. No. They're not here. We can talk about them. That's not true. But it's clear that fetuses lack the present ability to exercise these powers, so therefore they're not persons. They're just human beings. And what makes life valuable, what makes any life valuable, isn't the species you belong to, but whether you can exercise these powers, and since the fetus lacks these powers, it's not a person. Now, there are numerous counterexamples to this. I've employed them, others as well. What about when human beings are sleeping? What about people who are in comatose states and so forth? And those are all good counterarguments. We don't have time to go over them here, but my point is to show you how that idea of distinguishing personhood from human being leads to this. Right? And it's an argument that pro-lifers have responded to. But many of the best responses really don't come up and aren't published until maybe the late 1970s, early 1980s, long before the damage has already been done. So we have to get ahead of the game and meet the arguments head on. And not always rely on the fact that our friends and neighbors are always going to hold the same intuitions as us. Because remember, in the old days, people would say something like this: look, the difference between a newborn and a late-term fetus is indistinguishable. Therefore, abortion is just a form of infanticide, and we all know infanticide is wrong. You know what's happened? There are people now who have bitten the bullet and say, oh, since I know abortion is right, infanticide must be right too. So we have to be prepared to deal with the arguments before our counterexamples get swallowed up by the rule. That is, dead men do bleed after all. Right? That's what's going on. All right, let's move on to the second point. Reason matters. Reason matters. What's reason? Reason is our cognitive power to think, to evaluate things, to make distinctions, to give examples, to give universal principles, or to discover universal principles and use them in particular cases. That's what distinguishes us from other creatures in the world, right? In fact, it's always weird whenever I hear a politician answer a hypothetical by saying that they don't answer hypothetical questions. And it's weird because that's what laws really are, right? I mean, laws kind of answer a question about future hypotheticals. That's why the laws aren't written for particular things, but for particular things that happen under a universal category, right? So this is why we have rules against homicide and manslaughter and so forth. It's sort of an odd. I always would love to hear a media person do this when a politician says, I don't answer hypothetical questions, to immediately say, okay, let's imagine it's not a hypothetical question. Just to see their... But that's what reason is. Reason is our ability. It's not simply our ability to calculate. That's a kind of modern view of reason. That's just simply, the mouse trying to figure out where the cheese is in the maze kind of view of reason. No, reason is much broader and richer than that. It involves our ability to think things through. In fact, the greatest writers you've probably ever read are the greatest reasoners. Right? In my lifetime, I've read people like G.K. Chesterton and C.S. Lewis. I'm a big fan of P.J. O'Rourke, the political writer. Some academics today like Hadley Arkes at Amherst College, Robert George at Princeton. Those are people that you read them and you think, wow, what an insight. It seems so obviously true. Why didn't I think about that a moment ago? Right? Those are great writers when you say, aha, that seems so obvious, right? It's like when you hear a really good song, it usually sounds both old and new at the same time. It's like it sounds like it could have been 100 years ago, right? That's true of good reasoning is like that as well. So reason matters. In fact, in the Christian tradition, the second person of the Trinity is called the Logos, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. That's where the word comes. It comes from the Greek for logos. And that also refers to reason, right? So this is why the early church fathers, many of them referred to the second person of the Trinity, Jesus, as the wisdom of God in Proverbs. Now, not everyone agrees with, there's a debate about that, but generally that was the thinking, right? So reason is something that is not only something that, let's say, Christian believers can exercise. If you're a Christian, obviously everyone can exercise it, because the logos, according to what Christians have taught for millennia, is that the logos permeates everything, right? Including people who may not believe in the logos, right? Our rational abilities. This is why we can appreciate, let's say, ideas and thoughts from people who we may not agree with on some things, maybe people who aren't within our religious tradition, because the logos is kind of expresses itself everywhere. So now, how does this apply to, how does reason matter to the issue of the sanctity of life? Well, we can employ the rational powers that God has given us in order to clarify and explain the pro-life view to our fellow citizens on whose hearts the natural law is written. Let me give you several examples here. One example is, again, from my own experience. 1992, I was a delegate to the, I don't want to mention a political party, but I was a delegate to the county convention of one of the two major parties in Nevada. And I was the chair of the platform committee for the, no, it was a state convention. Oh, no, it was the county convention. This is 24 years, it's a long time. So it was a county convention, and when you're the platform chair, the way we did it in Nevada, of course it's probably changed since then, we had precinct meetings. And precinct meetings, people would get together, select, if it was a presidential year, who they would select to be president, and then they would put on little pieces of paper what they wanted in the party platform. And typically it would, virtually nothing was disputed except for abortion, gay rights, and in Nevada, prostitution. Prostitution is legal in every county in Nevada except for Clark and Washoe, which is where Las Vegas and Reno are at. So this is always controversial. So when I had to meet with the members of the platform committee, we sat down and went through all the little sheets of paper. And of course, we would, detect, certain trends, and we would realize that these would be the issues that would be debated at the convention. And we crafted the platform in light of these little pieces of paper. And we knew there was a slight pro-life majority, but we knew this would be debated at the convention. So I suggested that the language for the pro-life plank in the platform say this: the Clark County blank party of Nevada affirms a woman's right to terminate her pregnancy if and only if it does not result in the death of her unborn child. Now, the pro-lifers on the committee were actually saying, you can't say that. That's just going to, it's going to get people upset, and and they didn't like the language. And I said, no, the point of the language, look, we're going to debate it at the convention. Why don't we write language that actually forces those that dispute it to actually deal with the issue, right? So it got on there. And so here I was actually at a podium, not unlike this, with 2 lines of people at each mic debating the issue. And so the first guy, I'll never forget him, he was the wife of he was the husband. Oh boy, he was the husband. His wife was really very politically active in Nevada and very strongly pro-choice, although it was not the majority view in the party. He said, well, I don't like the language. I said, what would you change about it? And I read it. I said, we believe in a woman's right to terminate a pregnancy if and only if it does not result in the death of her unborn child. And he says, well, the second part. I said, so you want us to say that it will result in the death of the unborn child? And he says, no, I don't want to say it that way. I said, well, what are you disputing then? So this was great because it allowed a kind of teachable moment, right? I mean, a lot of times people think that it's all about just winning, getting the law in. It's also about debating, because debating actually makes people have to deal with the arguments and beliefs that they hold. My friend Hadley Arcus, who was instrumental in the Born Alive Infant Protections Act, which was passed during the last Bush administration. Hadley was actually the guy that drafted the whole thing. Several of his former students at Amherst College are in Congress. And one of those students called up Hadley one day. He said, "Hadley, it's going to pass without any debate on the floor. Congratulations." He goes, "No, I want debate on the floor. I want," was his name, Jerry, I forget, congressman from Massachusetts or New York, who's very strongly pro-choice, said, because Jerry saw this as a poison pill, right? Because once you start debating whether you want infants who are born as a consequence of an abortion gone wrong dead, you actually then have to deal with that issue in public on C-SPAN, right? And so he said he got the word from Planned Parenthood and other organizations, NARL, just vote it. Forget about it. Don't talk about it. And so the other side just folded. And so Hadley's former student said, "This is great." And Hadley said, "No, it isn't great. I want them to, the whole point of it isn't, because the law isn't going to actually save all that many lives. It will save some, to be sure. But the point of it is also to teach us, right? To actually have a public conversation to educate. All right. Another example of Reason Matters, and this is, I'm going to borrow from my friend Greg Kokel, who's the president of Stand to Reason. Soon after my book, Politically Correct Death, had come out in 1993, actually, when I first met Greg Kokel, and Greg interviewed me on his radio show, and he said, "I think I can summarize your book in just 2 sentences." I said, Thanks for the sales help, Greg. Because most of the book deals with the arguments that one often hears in the popular culture for abortion. So, for example, you'll hear, what if, if we don't have abortion, then more children will be born into poverty? And my response is, well, that's begging the question. That's assuming that the unborn child is not a human person. Because after all, another way we can end poverty is to actually kill all the children that already are born living in poverty, right? And of course, that kind of draws out that the other side is actually assuming the non-personhood of the unborn, which means that they're not focusing on the real question that's doing all the work, okay? So Greg said this. Greg said, if the unborn child is not a person, no popular arguments are necessary. But if the unborn child is a person, no popular arguments are relevant. And that's right. I mean, that's another case where using your reason crystallizes the question. Right? Crystallizes the question. So I like the way Greg says that. It's a wonderful way of presenting it, and it's a way to refocus people's attention. I did that in my conversation with the optometrist at the Las Vegas Athletic Club by asking her whether if cases of rape or incest had never occurred, whether she'd still be for abortion rights. Her answering it by saying, "I still be for it," meant what? That she was not on the right question. Right? She was bringing up other things, although important, not relevant to the question at hand. Another example, and this will bring us back now to the personhood human being distinction that I mentioned earlier when discussing David Boonin's essay. Now, a couple of years ago, some of you may have heard about this article. In fact, it's astonishing that people were astonished by it. It was an article published by 2 Italian philosophers, Alberto Giubellini and Francesca Minerva. By the way, if you're going to be Italian, those are 2 pretty good names, right? Alberto Giubellini and Francesca Minerva. Now, the article was controversial. They defended something called after-birth abortion. Now, what I found astonishing is that people were upset about this, and I think that's a good thing they were upset. But the fact that people were surprised by it was astonishing to me. And I think the reason is that most of the articles defending infanticide were published prior to the ascendancy of the internet and social media. So even though those of us who write in this area and teach in this area have known for quite some time that there are people like Peter Singer and Michael Tooley, and to a lesser extent David Boonin. And David actually doesn't believe in infanticide, by the way. He has a different view. So I don't want to include David in that group. But there are a number of philosophers, James Rachels, I believe, was another, who defend this idea of that that parents should be given the opportunity to tell a physician not to offer life support to a child if they don't want it after it's born. Peter Singer believes it should be up to 18 months afterwards. Now, so I found astonishing that people actually found this to be earth-shattering. I mean, it is earth-shattering in one sense, but it's not new. That's the point. So their article was published actually first online in March 2012, and it was published in print in May 2013. I wrote a response that was published in the print edition. It was a Journal of Medical Ethics does like most journals do now. They publish online first, and then there's a print edition that comes out roughly anywhere from 6 months to a year later. I wrote this response actually a couple of months after their article originally appeared online, and when the print edition came out, they had my article right alongside Jubilee and Minerva, and Journal of Medical Ethics is probably the most prestigious secular medical ethics journal, so it was an honor to be in it, but it was also, I was to credit the editors for allowing alternative points of view, and there were others besides me. There were 3 or 4 other pro-life academics, and actually some non-pro-life academics who were disturbed by this article. So let's go back to talk about how this ties into what I said earlier about Boonin. Jubilee and Minerva say, they take person, the word person to mean, this is a quote here from their article, to mean an individual who is capable of attributing to her own existence some basic value such that being deprived of this existence represents a loss to her. What does that mean? What are they saying? They're saying that they're saying the fetus is not a person because it is not mature enough to appreciate its own interests. But that's odd because that is precisely what a fetus is anyways. Right? I mean, think about it. A fetus is a being that is immature, and because it's immature, it can't appreciate its own interest, just like when I'm asleep, I can't appreciate my own interest, right? So the argument really amounts to the fetus is not a person because it's a fetus. It's not really an argument, but still, that's what they offer. It's perfectly circular, in other words. Now, but that's not really the flaw in the argument. I mean, it's one flaw, but there's another mistake here. And it's the fact they use this term potential person. They say the fetus is not a full person, it's a potential person. It's a stock label in academic bioethics. But it's a weird term because if I say, for example, that I'm a potential French speaker, that means that I'm a something who has a certain type of potential, right? So if I say that I'm a potential professor at University of Colorado, which is true, I am. I mean, I know that unless something happens between now and then, but I have that potential, even before I was offered the position, right? So if you're a certain kind of thing, you have certain types of potential. So, for example, if you know somebody that has lost their eyesight, and you say they're blind, right? That means that they have, because they are beings of a certain kind, a potential to see, although they lack the physical ability to see. If they could be cured, they'd be able to see. We don't say that about a rock. We don't say the rock is blind. The rock can't see, but it's not blind. What's the difference? Well, to not see is not the same thing to be blind. Blind means you lack something. The rock doesn't lack anything. It's a perfectly good rock, even without seeing. Okay? So, let's apply this to another example. The oak tree. Let's say I have an oak tree in my backyard. It's a potential desk, which is to say, right? Which is to say that a carpenter can build a desk with the parts that were once my oak tree. When the oak tree is killed before the carpenter works on its parts, it literally ceases to be. There is nothing in the nature of the oak tree by which it is ordered towards deskness, right? Neither when it was an acorn nor when it was ordered toward becoming a more mature version of itself as a sapling, okay? But that's not the kind of potential the fetus has. The fetus, according to Jubilee and Minerva, it doesn't cease to be. It still is the same thing, and yet it acquires these other characteristics by nature. So it's not like the potential of an oak tree to be a desk. But what other kind of potentials are there? Well, there's the ones that I employed just a moment ago. There are sort of accidental potentials that we all have. I could be a French speaker if I studied, right? I could weigh 10 pounds less. I could, change my hair color. those are all things that I can do and I have potentials to do, but it doesn't change the nature of what I am, right? I'm still the sort of thing that I am. Now, what's fascinating here is that Jubilee and Minerva are saying that every single fetus is potentially a person. But what they're really saying is every single fetus has a personal nature. But to have a personal nature is not the same thing as being a potential person. Because to be a potential person, it's kind of an awkward way of speaking, right? Because when I say that the oak tree can become the desk, it literally ceases to be. Whereas if I say that I can acquire, if I have the potential to acquire characteristics by which I can exercise my personhood, communicate, speak, reason, and so forth, I'm still the same thing during all the changes, right? So this is the problem. The fetus isn't a potential person. They're wrong. It is what it is. It's a being with a personal nature, and for that reason, it has, and this is a technical philosophy term, it has essential properties that include the capacities for personal expression, rational thought, and moral agency. The maturation of these capacities are perfections of its nature. That is, what do I mean by perfections of its nature? Now, in the last 2 years, I've had 2 detached retinas, and I'm seeing fine. It's kind of scary, and I could have gone blind. But when my sight is restored, that's not an odd thing, right? Because that's what I'm supposed to have, right? It's a perfection of my nature to see. So when a philosopher says perfection of nature, he or she doesn't mean you're going to be perfect. It just means a mature version of what you ought to be, right? So your development is simply a kind of outfolding of what you already are. So this is the illustration I use against Jubilee and Minerva in order to sort of tie this all together. Imagine, for example, that a scientist brings several embryos into being through in vitro fertilization. He then implants them in artificial wombs, and while they develop, he obstructs their neural tubes so that they may never acquire higher brain functions. This, by the way, is how anencephalic children actually come into being, not on purpose, but accidentally, right, as a result of a genetic defect. So, supposing that happens, suppose you have this mad scientist, he clones embryos and then obstructs their development of their neural tube, no higher brain functions. According to Jubilee and Minerva and people like Tooley and Singer and other philosophers, these are not persons, right? Because they can never be considered persons and they never will become persons. It is because the scientist wants to harvest the organs of these fetuses that he's engaging in this experiment. Suppose, however, upon hearing of this scientist's grisly undertaking, a group of pro-life radicals breaks into his laboratory and transports all the artificial wombs, with all the embryos intact, to another laboratory located in the basement of the Vatican. While there, several pro-life scientists inject the embryos with a drug that heals the neural tubes and allows for their brains to develop normally. After 9 months, the former fetuses, now infants, are adopted by loving families. If you think that the pro-life scientists did was not only good, but an act that justice requires, it seems that you must believe that embryos are beings of a personal nature, ordered towards certain perfections, and when obstructed, results in a wrong. But in that case, embryos are not potential persons, they are persons with potential. That's the difference. Finally, people die. Since 1973, there has been, at least in terms of abortion, there are obviously other types of unjust deaths concerning the sanctity of life, but with abortion, over 40, maybe 42 million unborn human beings killed. It has contributed to a general diminishing of our respect for prenatal life, as the debates over cloning and embryonic stem cell research, I think, have shown us. But the reasoning that gave us abortion on demand, that there are some lives that are less valuable than others because these lives lack certain present qualities, ultimately, I think, undermines the basis for liberal democracy. If you think about it, once you start picking and choosing what sort of human beings have intrinsic dignity, based on standards that really run across a continuum. Think about the standards by which these human beings are evaluated. Oh, they haven't achieved rationality. But the reality is that all of us have, that's a degreed property. Nobody is actually equally rational or equally attractive or equally gifted in different ways, right? We have them on a continuum. So we have to ground our dignity in something deeper than that. And that's got to be who we are by nature. In conclusion, when discussing these questions with friends and family, peers, protagonists, antagonists, remember these three truths you heard here this afternoon. Ideas have consequences, reason matters, and people die. For at the end of the day, the debates about the sanctity of human life are about who and what we are and whether we can know it. The cultural conflict over the permissibility of abortion, euthanasia, and the other bioethical issues is really a dispute about over whether or not we are justified in extending our nation's moral progress toward the elimination of unjust discrimination to include those who are the most vulnerable in the human family, the unborn, the severely disabled, the elderly. It is, in the end, whether we like it or not, a testimony to that inescapable truth penned by Aristotle over 2 millennia ago. Statecraft is soulcraft. Thank you, and God bless you. Thank you very much. Thank you.